We're going to get moving here because we're a little late. Where's Carrie?
Right here.
You want to say something first? Or?
Ladies and gentlemen, here's Dennis.
Sorry for the craziness. Welcome to the Glenn Miller Army Air Forces Orchestra Diamond Jubilee celebration. I hope this will be entertaining and informative. Hopefully. We're going to start with something right now that I thought I'm going to get play it. Pardon me? Oh, the house lights better. The house lights. Can we hear the sound? Can we hear the sound? Or is it not getting through?
What's your microphone?
That's it going through the projector. Could you guys hear the sound of all of that? Yeah. Okay, good. So the music quality won't be what this is designed to be, but we're going to proceed in the spirit of time. Well, all right. I'm going to just talk then and do the slides. The discussion today is Glenn Miller, a study in leadership. The one thing we find out about the Army Air Force Orchestra is that we can't decouple the history of the orchestra without talking about the leadership qualities of Glenn Miller. He was an American original. This is a picture that he gave to his brother, Dean, and this is the young Glenn Miller. And I think it's a great place to start his military career by looking at who he really was and where he came from. Glenn Miller set himself apart from his peers between the years of 1924, when he left college and started working in territory bands, till he started his own band. You know, when we talk about Glenn, he is very different. Once you look into him closely, he's very different than any of his contemporaries in so many ways. He was, like them, a talented musician. Like some of them, he was a very good arranger. But unlike many of them, he was a great organizer. He had all three talents and skills in his toolkit. And that stood him apart and gave him a great advantage. He worked in jazz bands, including Ben Pollock and Red Nichols, so he was certainly had jazz credentials and bona fides. I bristle sometimes when I hear or read about jazz critics in the 50s and 60s and 70s, you know, being kind of condescending towards him. He was well sought after by these band leaders. But something happened to Glenn during the production of the show Girl Crazy. George Gershwin had enough confidence in this young man to allow him to write parts for this important and high-profile Broadway show. And that's what started, I think, Glenn on the road to being something more than just a jazz musician, but a Broadway musician and Broadway and studio orchestra presence. I think perhaps his marriage to Helen and her influence had something to do with this in terms of moving him into a stable line of work, as you might see it. He became very much sought after by studio and radio orchestras, but then what we sometimes fail to remember about him, he organized the Dorsey Brothers Orchestra. He organized Ray Noble's American Band. He studied with Dr. Joseph Schillinger. One of the famous things we find out, the famous quotes we have, is that Glenn, unlike Tommy Dorsey and Benny Goodman, had the presence of mind and perhaps patience to stick it out with Schillinger over a long period of time. And he shared that characteristic with none other than George Gershwin. And then, of course, last but not least, he had the presence of mind, courage to invest in his own competitive big band, which was not a sure thing, but he had options. He could have gone to Hollywood and joined the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer film department, film studios in the music department. So he had options in life. By 1941, Glenn Miller was #1 in records, radio, and motion pictures. He had an uncanny public pulse. It's almost as though, now he had his clunkers. I think I mentioned this before. Papa Nicolini comes to mind. He kept furiously trying to broadcast it over and over and over, and it never went anywhere. So from time to time, Glenn did have his clunkers, but he generally speaking, if he did something, it worked. He was a patriot, and we can't lose sight of this. He was genuinely concerned about his country, about his countrymen, and I think he felt he owed a debt of gratitude to people who bought his records and listened to his broadcasts and went to the movies. He was making a lot of money. He didn't feel guilty about making the money, but he felt he had a responsibility to give back. The war was looming. 1941, it was hard to escape that something was going to happen. Most Americans, in fact, the majority of Americans, hoped nothing would happen. But that was perhaps, now that we look back, wishful thinking. The USO had been formed in 1941 from a bunch of different charitable organizations at the urging of President Roosevelt, so that the United States would have a unified effort to help people coming into the armed forces health and welfare. And Glenn, of course, put the Sunset Serenade broadcast that we all know on the air to fill that need. But then, of course, something terrible happened, and that was Pearl Harbor, and America was thrust into the conflict. Glenn, can you hear that? We're playing Anchors Away for a reason. It's a nice picture of the band in Hollywood at CBS. Just read that list of where he was at this time. All his contracts were renewed or were renewing. He was in a good position. But he decided to go ahead and stick his neck out and apply for a commission in the United States Navy, his first choice. That's a nice picture of Glenn at Great Lakes, Illinois, courtesy of Ed Kolch. However, the music industry at this time was in a state of great upheaval. Glenn made a patriotic but also don't lose sight of the fact, a pragmatic decision. He had several considerations on his mind. The American Federation of Musicians were about to strike the recording industry. In other words, all his RCA Bluebird and soon-to-be RCA Victor records were going to be stopped. Cash rationing. It wasn't easy to start driving buses all around the country to one-nighters. Railroad travel was becoming prioritized. It wasn't easy to drag a lot of musicians around the country to other events. And also importantly, musicians were being depleted by the military draft. One of the first people Glenn lost, of course, was Trigger Alpert in 1941. So Glenn took very proactive steps to insert himself more into the war effort because he felt that hanging around is making a lot of money without a uniform on was not the best use of his time or ability. He was denied a commission in the United States Navy. One of the reasons for that was that the Navy was going through some turbulence and troubles with a recruiting scandal. The feeling was that naval commissions were being given to entertainers and people in Hollywood so they could avoid draft status. Glenn wasn't really part of that because his draft status was 3A, not 1A. But they, nevertheless, the Navy denied Glenn the commission for whatever reasons they had. So being Glenn Miller, he immediately contacted the United States Army. And he had many contractual obligations that he needed to sort out. A lot of lives and incomes were affected by Glenn's decision. And at the time, you will find in contemporaneous media reports some criticism of Glenn for going in. Because, you know, a lot of paychecks were tied into him. He was accepted by the United States Army, and I think his great line is, I, like every patriotic American, have an obligation to fulfill. He disbanded effective September 27, 1942. And this is a shot from earlier in May of 42 where Glenn's kind of humorously getting sergeant chevrons pinned on him at Fort Sheridan, Illinois at a Chesterfield broadcast. So he goes into the United States Army, but not exactly the United States Army. It's the Army Specialist Corps. It was a branch of the Army that was kind of an ad hoc thing that was created right after Pearl Harbor to fast-track entertainment and music, entertainment, and recreational officers into the Army because they felt they would need a lot of that suddenly for morale and recreation. He was assigned to the Omaha, Nebraska, believe it or not. He was assigned here to his first duty, the regional branch of the Army Specialist Corps. But he was sent immediately to a training course in Fort Meade, Maryland. This was not popular with the regular U.S. Army because they had regular officer training courses that took up 90-day wonders. Glenn was a 2-week wonder or a 3-week wonder. The Army Specialist Corps was a real fast track. And there was a lot of controversy internally in the Army about it. And Glenn shared the opinion of the United States Army, which was he was less than impressed with the course material. He thought it had nothing to do with why he had joined the military. And what was he going to do? Go out and be a morale officer in South Dakota or North Dakota? His name was Glenn Miller, and the Army wasn't giving him any satisfaction as to why they might want to use him. The ASC was disbanded during the time Glenn was in this course. So what happened was that all of the officers in the course, including band leader Wayne King, who was in with Glenn, were given commissions in the regular United States Army. And I always tell people, Glenn's service records do not say United States Army Reserve. It says Army of the United States. He was a regular officer, not a reserve officer for the duration. So, but something intervened. When the Service Corps disbanded, within 48 hours, orders were sent to the Army Service Corps, where the Specialist Corps had been and it was disbanded. Glenn had ended up in the Service Corps by default. And the commanding general of the Service Corps got this memo on behalf of General H.H. Arnold, who commanded a separate service or a separate part of the United States Army called the Army Air Forces, saying, we claim him. They had a reason for wanting to claim him. He perfectly fit what they were trying to accomplish. This branch of the service, as you will see from these slides, these guys wanted him. Arnold was trying to convince the people of the United States what an Air Force was. This is 1942, not now. Who knew what an Air Force was? Or why you needed 2 million people to staff it? Or what their jobs were going to be? 90% of which were on the ground, supporting flyers. So Arnold had a big job ahead of him. He had to build and maintain a global Air Force. Recruit and train personnel and tend to their health, welfare, and morale. And so you might imagine that what they then did was build a remarkable public relations branch. Look at this. They cooperated with Hollywood, all the big movie studios. They created their own motion picture unit in Culver City with people in Hollywood that would have been drafted. They said, well, we have a job for you. You can help us make training films and help support the film industry and films that tell the American people what the Air Force is and why we're important. They also created radio units, the first of which was in Santa Ana, but worked out of Hollywood. In other words, Glenn wasn't the first person to go on network radio for the Army Air Forces. Eddie Dunstetter, Felix Slack, and Harry Bluestone, and announcer Lieutenant William Holden, the actor, were already in. And of course, Broadway. You might remember a show called Winged Victory. It was the Air Force's answer to This Is the Army. Staffed by many people, too long to mention here. You'll remember their names if I were to rattle them off to you. A lot of them ended up in television. Many famous actors. And it was created by Moss Hart, Swifty Gulzar, Lieutenant Leonard Dupar, and someone named Norman Layden conducted the orchestra. Glenn was immediately made Director of Bands for the Technical Training Command of the Army Air Forces. Actually, the technical term was Director of Bands / Training. The commanding general approved a plan that was submitted to him by Glenn in January of '43 for creation of a network of AAF bands around the country and the creation of an elite radio production unit to be based in New York, and so not surprisingly commanded by him. The Technical Training Command and the Flight Training Commands were later merged in 1943 under the command of General Barton Yount in Fort Worth, Texas. This will be Glenn's duty station for the rest of his time in the Armed Forces. He was officially assigned to AAF Command at Fort Worth. And General Yount essentially gave Glenn carte blanche authority to do whatever the hell he needed to do. And I don't say that lightly. Glenn got carte blanche authority to circumvent all red tape, all bureaucracy, and get whatever he needed. And being Glenn Miller, he took advantage of this situation. The famous quote, which Johnny Desmond remembered, was, you know, Desmond, I didn't bring you into this band to sound like Bing Crosby or anybody else. I want you to sound like Johnny Desmond. Because, you know, if Frank Sinatra's drafted, I will get him. And I can replace you. Glenn put together this talent scout thing that he did, was done at Atlantic City, New Jersey, at a basic training center near New York, where a lot of musicians who were getting drafted. Glenn created a system whereby that if they were to be drafted, there was a set of paperwork that he put together where you could quickly end up with him in the Army Air Forces rather than in the Army in basic training. And again, this is where he got in crosshairs with a lot of these mid-level officers. So when you hear all these stories about Glenn butting heads with people in the military, it wasn't with the upper brass. It was with all the established, hardline old Army officers that said, who are you and why are you in our face? So what did Glenn put together? I think one of the most incredible arrays of virtuoso talent that ever existed. Arrangers, producers, directors, writers, announcers, actors, vocalists, musicians, too numerous to name. Musicians who, when they got their orders in places like Boca Raton, Florida, or Greenville, South Carolina, said, why have I been assigned to Glenn Miller? I worked for the NBC Symphony, I worked for the Cleveland Symphony. What does he have to do with me? What they didn't know was what he was forming, which was a large concert orchestra and radio production unit, not just a big band, although that was embedded within the entire structure. And this is what happened. Glenn wasn't initially known for his network radio broadcasts. He got in trouble. He was thought, the public's first brush with him was probably in a September 6, 1943 article in Time magazine called Sousa with a Floy Floy. Now this article was written in jest, but Glenn got in a lot of hot water over this one because he was quoted in the article as saying, "There's no doubt about it, anybody can improve upon Sousa." And he also went on to say that there isn't a decent army band in the entire country. That's, if you read, that's what he actually, now he claimed he was misquoted. But in any event, the Army Air Forces didn't have a problem with this so much because they were fully behind him modernizing military music, and that was to be the mission. That was part of, but they wanted to appeal to younger people. They didn't want to appeal to World War I veterans. But the United States Army, in the person of General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff, did not appreciate these comments because he had kind of an obsession with the U.S. Army band and music. So the AAF quickly got a letter of complaint from Marshall. Glenn had to write a letter of retraction. Why military music? Well, in addition to their duties as radio production unit, to justify their existence, as Ed pointed out in our panel, they had to march. They had to provide marching. Glenn's musicians had to be spread across the different departments at New Haven. See, he had 60, 70, 80 men, and a normal Army band contingent was only 28 people. So there were guys in the mesh unit, there were guys in the headquarters detachment, and they all gathered for their radio broadcasts. But they did have to march, and they did have to move around. But once again, Glenn got creative. And you've all heard the famous quote in the movie The Glenn Miller Story, which is actually a true story. An Army music officer at New Haven said, "Blues, my God!" Because they're marching around the New Haven Green playing blues of all things. And Glenn actually did say, "Well, tell me, Major, are we still flying the same airplanes that we flew in World War I?" To which the commanding officer at New Haven, Colonel Richard Reeves, laughed and dismissed both of them. And obviously Reeves was amused. He thought Miller was on the right track because he could see the cadets marching with smiles on their faces. And someone I need to mention right here, and I'm sorry I didn't go through the whole thing I wanted it to. Well, someone I'm going to mention here is then Corporal, soon to be Technical Sergeant Ray McKinley, and there he is smiling on top of his Jeep in the Yale Bowl. And then moving along on the New Haven Green, there was a March of Time episode made about this. It's very brief. It's about a 30 to 40 second film clip of the band marching along. And they're playing Blues in the Night March rather than St. Louis Blues March. But it's like the only recording we have of this band playing that. They only used the Jeeps once. And when Ed told me that, I was astonished, but I went back and it's true. They only used the Jeeps for one occasion, a rally to promote fundraising for an aircraft carrier, the USS Shangri-La. And the band of Jeeps came in and rolled around the Yale Bowl, and the band marched along. And then later, the Radio Concert Orchestra performed for the event off on a stage. They only did this once. Soon after this, Glenn was not commanding officer of the radio production unit. That was Major Francis Healy, the man on the left. He was an NBC executive that had gone in uniform. Healy wasn't around long, only a few months, and then later Glenn became full commander of the entire unit. Glenn was the music director of the unit. These are very important people in this unit. George Voutsas is the producer-director who came from the NBC Symphony broadcasts. Jerry Gray, you know who he is, Don Rosso Graziano. And Don Briggs was a Hollywood actor who was actually an executive officer of the unit. Look at how much work they had. This is what Glenn had wanted to do. This is why he was in uniform. In the doesn't sound like the 1939 recording. Different musicians. This is the Vanderbilt Theater in New York, which was several blocks from NBC's headquarters at Rockefeller Center. They broadcast many shows from here. One of the reasons they put Glenn into the Vanderbilt was they had it all to themselves on Saturdays for rehearsals. So Glenn liked that. He didn't have any interference because he could have the thing for the whole day. They had to do 2 broadcasts, one at 6 p.m. Eastern War Time and one at 11:30 p.m. Eastern War Time. They shared the theater with somebody named Guy Lombardo. He had it on Sundays. The band also did work for the Office of War Information, who had an international broadcasting service set up that they'd inherited from NBC and CBS, and they had to then add on to. The towers in Bethany, Ohio, many of you know from WOW in Cincinnati were part of this. Major broadcasting signals going out from the United States all over the world. And who would you want to have on these broadcasts? Glenn Miller. They were recorded. These were not recorded at the Vanderbilt Theater. They were recorded at Rockefeller Center. That's why the sound on the surviving recordings is so awesome. The band also made V-discs for the United States Army, some of which ended up on Navy labels. And one of my famous stories about Glenn is it required his name on the labels. They were just going to say 418th Army Air Forces Band. And Glenn held up the first recording session and said, no, the name Glenn Miller is going to be on that record, or we're not doing it. Calls Tony Janik, the producer, put a couple calls into Washington, Glenn Miller's name on the V-discs. Hope you can hear me.
No.
Oh, excuse me, just trying to turn the sound. He's picturing more ones. An acquaintance of Glenn's from when he had applied for service in the Army came to visit him at the Vanderbilt Theater between programs, well actually before the first show on April 29, 1944. And he had a question for me. What was that? What happened? Okay, we're good. Right. Well, anyway, what was that? Wow. We're coming from that. Anyway, Kirby was the War Department Director of Radio Broadcasting. Kirby was moving on to a new job. Kirby had been offered a position in England with Supreme Headquarters Allied Command as head of radio broadcasting. He was being loaned to them. And his question was, would Glenn be interested in coming along? And Glenn said yes. And so long as you don't tell Helen before I do. Well, as it turns out, Kirby's wife and Paul Dudley's wife, Joy, were out with Helen at the time. And the three of them came back and joined their husbands for dinner. But I think Glenn told Helen about what the conversation had been with Colonel Kirby probably afterwards. I don't know that. Kirby was going to be working for General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. And this is the cable that General Eisenhower sent to General Marshall in Washington on May 24, 1944, requesting the services of Glenn Miller, saying that we're putting a radio network on the air, an Allied radio network. We require an entertainment unit like Major Glenn Miller, or Captain Glenn Miller, and that he is the only one suited for this role. Kirby, I think, wrote the memo. But in any event, this was sent back to Washington, and the General Arnold and General Marshall were in a position of having to say yes. And this was being done, this new radio network was going on the air for a reason.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, for a special announcement from the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces from London,
seat. This is a feature of the American Band of the Supreme Allied Command. The American Band of the Supreme Allied Command, under the direction of Capt. The program featuring the voices of Britton Spearlin and Royal Air Force Sergeant Jimmy Miller. Now, before we go any further, I want to pass along a word of thanks to all the fine folks in the British Isles. The way you've made us feel welcome is a real thrill. You made us feel that you have not only taken us into your home, but into your hearts as well. And to you Yanks over here, well, all I can say is we're mighty glad to be here with you.
Another busy schedule. Very good. Much busier than even here. Initially rejected the British female stars being coupled with his band by the AAF producers, and they convinced him it might be in his best interest to work with them. He was under a misunderstanding he was being in command of his own broadcasts. And they said, no, we're going to tell you, our job is to have Allied unity. And he grudgingly accepted them on his broadcasts. He felt he had a self-contained entertainment unit that was well rehearsed to his standards. However, American stars did come over and they also appeared with him. Glenn was not a native German speaker. General Marshall came back into Glenn's life on November 14, 1944. Glenn was called to a meeting with General Walter Bedell Smith, Chief of Staff of SHAEF under Eisenhower. Smith was technically Glenn's boss, more or less, through several levels. Miller was offered the command of the United States Army Band that had been, General Marshall had asked Smith to extend to him. SHAEF was very pleased because they certainly wanted to keep Miller. He and the band were the crown jewel of their radio network. They certainly didn't want him to walk away. So they were pretty happy when he said decline the offer. He declined it for obvious and evident reasons. It was kind of a weird offer to begin with. Nobody understood it, even at SHAEF. But it was a productive meeting, and it's come down in folklore that it lasted 5 minutes. It was certainly a little bit longer than that, because Schmidt was an involved and interested officer who wanted to know what was going on. I do believe that at this meeting, Glenn, not realizing it and describing his activities to Smith, sold the concept of moving his band from London to Paris. Glenn had wanted to be closer to the men in the front lines. The AAF band special was allowed to make plans to transfer to Paris because AAFP had overrun the French broadcasting facilities, and the Army Signal Corps and the BBC technicians were rebuilding them to allow Allied broadcasts directly from Paris. This would also give the band the ability to appear to ground troops on the continent, because they had only appeared in live performances to Air Force units. But the catch was Glenn committed to record 83 programs, or 28 3/4 hours of programs, to fill 6 weeks of programming in the event BBC couldn't get the signals back from France to England for broadcast over AAFP. They were trying to rebuild broadcast circuits between France and England. Those ended up being rebuilt, but they needed that cushion to make sure that they would get reliable broadcasts. In the event they actually did. Now, there was a sense of urgency about this because Glenn had made this commitment given the fact that the band would have adequate broadcasting facilities, if not transmission lines. And the facilities were being built at the Olympia Theater, which was controlled by the United States Army. And the Army Signal Corps technicians not yet finished it because the French workers in the theater were on a semi-strike. And they were refusing to work with U.S. Army Signal Corps. They wanted to be paid more. So the arrangements were running behind schedule. They were incomplete. There were other details involved that are described in my book. David Niven, Glenn's direct report, Glenn reported to Niven, and Niven ordered him to travel ahead of the band by authorized transportation. That was regular Army transport flights that flew from London to Paris, to huddle up with him and get this handled, because you have to understand the logistics of moving that large organization of 64 men. It wasn't easy, and they just couldn't move on a dime because of all their equipment and everything else. And they also didn't want to have them stranded in Paris with nothing to do because they couldn't do their work. So Miller was anxious to get to Paris to solve these issues. And as we all know, unfortunately, he was in a rush. The scheduled air transport command flights were canceled. Glenn accepted an unauthorized invitation, unauthorized for him. The man extending the invitation had an authorization for the flight. Glenn was not authorized to take what they called casual transportation. And I guarantee you, if he had called or written to Niven or anybody at SHAEF and said, plans have changed, I'm not going to wait for the regular flights to go, I'm going to hitch a ride with an 8th Air Force Service Command officer named Norman Bizzell, he would have been turned down. And in the event, as we know, unfortunately, the plane went down into the water. Now, there was some confusion about this because something else happened the next morning after this flight to get in the way of confusing matters.
Good morning. Here's the NBC News from around the world. This is James Stevenson reporting from the NBC Newsroom in New York. In a few moments, we'll call an NBC observers from overseas. But first, here are the late developments. Reports seeping through the news blackout on the Western Front indicate that furious fighting is in progress on the northern sector, where the German counterattack has driven approximately 18 miles into Belgium. Allied planes are smashing at German armored columns. The German counterattack against the American First Army is not being taken lightly by Allied leaders. Allied headquarters are maintaining a strict secrecy on the situation for security reasons, because any factual information of losses or the steps being taken to stop the German drive would be helpful to the enemy.
Suddenly, the whereabouts of a major who played a trombone were not necessarily top priority to the United States military.
This is London. London calling in the home, overseas and European services of the BBC and through United Nations Radio Mediterranean.
Major Glenn Miller, the well-known American band leader, is reported missing. He left England by air for Paris 9 days ago. Major Glenn Miller came over from the States earlier this year to direct the American band of the AAF, which has often been heard playing in the Allied Expeditionary Forces program of the BBC.
When Glenn was declared missing, the band was already in Paris without him. So they proceeded with their broadcast schedules, and they proceeded with their concert appearances, hospitals. They would eventually tour across France, the French Riviera, into the Alps, Germany itself after the capitulation of the Reich, and in Holland before coming back to the United States. It's a lovely song, normally an arrangement. Sergeant Johnny Desmond. Eighth Air Force did investigate the accident, the apparent accident, came to conclusions, they determined negligence, and they enacted remedies. Officers deemed responsible in the chain of command for the plane being dispatched and lost their jobs. Flight dispatch rules, navigation rules, and other details that allowed a pilot to slip through a loophole to take a flight when he might not have wanted to take it in bad weather, those were changed. So some good came out. Desmond, I'm sorry, this went back too far, excuse me. I don't want to be stuck, so I have to go up by that. I was going to play the whole tune. And it's going to continue to play in a loop. The band eventually, obviously, was in Europe at the time that victory, their allies overran Germany. This is my favorite pictures of the end of the war. There are the American tank columns and jeeps running down the Autobahn, and the Wehrmacht is going up the median, the other direction, to the rear. It's a great picture. Desmond's going to keep singing it to us. After victory, General Omar Bradley and Field Marshal Ivan Konev of the 1st Ukrainian Army had a banquet at the Hotel Fürstenhof in Germany, and there are some films that were made by the U.S. Army Signal Corps of this event. The band appeared for this, and there's plenty of stories about the Soviet officers and the American officers imbibing quite a bit, and all the give and take and fun that they had together. It's an interesting thing to think about, considering what eventually happened with the Cold War and all of that. The band then appeared after the German capitulation and their German tour. This is Ray and the band at Nuremberg Stadium, and you know the significance of that. This is ironic. This is the Army Air Force band on the stage at the same stadium where Adolf Hitler gave all his famous speeches in the 1930s. You couldn't think of a more fitting place for them. And there are pictures of the Nazi insignia still attached to the place. Some of these American insignia covered up the Nazi insignia. And then, of course, the band was returned home, potentially for refitting and deployment to the Pacific. At basically the time they thought so. But of course, then we all know the bomb was dropped on Japan, the war ended, and the band came home. They went back to I Sustain the Wings for several months, and they, at the end of that a couple of days before the last I Sustain the Wings broadcast, they were honored at the National Press Club, and you all know the story where President Truman spontaneously stood to applaud them. When the band came out and the United States was played, he stood. And Prime Minister King of Canada was there, he stood. Everybody in the audience stood. It was quite a spontaneous show of respect for Glenn Miller. The band, after the presentation, is a picture of Eisenhower and General Arnold congratulating them and discharging them and saying, your job's over, you can go back to being band musicians, studio musicians, whatever the heck else you're going to do. You're out. You've done your job. So, Johnny will live in a moment. I just want to summarize quickly, so you get to lunch. The Army Air Force Orchestra's, what's their legacy? Who are they? Who were they? I think they were the embodiment of American culture for the Allied and enemy nations, not to be taken lightly. Everybody around the world, many of them first came into contact with American music through this band. It was the best big band that ever performed. I share Ray McKinley's sentiments 100%. They earned 4 Bronze Stars, 1 for Miller, for Don Haynes, Ray McKinley, and Jerry Gray. They received a unit citation from Supreme Commander Eisenhower at Frankfurt in July of 1945. They had an unmatched series of over 800 personal appearances. Now, bear in mind, that's in addition to their broadcast schedule. They had a profound impact on the recruiting, fundraising, and awareness for the Army Air Forces before they went overseas. In fact, there was a prolonged 2 or 3 week spell where arguments were going back and forth in Washington as to whether they were going to be released to go to Europe, because they had been that valuable here, and the Army wanted to get them back from the Air Force. They thought, we're going to send them to Europe, they're ours again. And the Air Force said, no, we're not going to send them to Europe unless they remain an Air Force unit, which ended up happening. And of course, legendary English and continental achievements. I mean, the British people loved them, and the people on the continent loved them as well. But what about Glenn? How does he stack up? What do we think of him as leader of this amazing organization that his mind and his work put together? I think we can safely say that he was the premier 20th century American band leader. Some people have said to me, do you think that the fact that Glenn disappeared is why we remember him now? And that's why he's legendary? And I would say no. I would say what I said at the beginning of the presentation. He was a musician, an arranger, an organizer, and then a very successful producer and broadcaster. And who knows, after the war he may have evolved from what we think of as a band leader to a very successful impresario. He gave up a fortune, comfort, and his life. He demanded excellence, always exhibited good taste, all the way through every Chesterfield program, every NBC sustaining broadcast. Every one of them is listenable. Every one of them has good quality product on it. He wouldn't accept anything less from himself or anybody else. He had integrity. He held others to the same standards he held himself to. I heard it described once as Douglas MacArthur or Martinet. He couldn't be more removed from Douglas MacArthur than the man on the moon. He's not Douglas MacArthur, he's Glenn Miller. He was not egotistical, he was efficient. He was decisive, he was a no-nonsense leader, he fired people, he knew how to do that. And he took risks. He was always pushing the envelope forward every step of the way. The 39 band does not sound like the 42 band, which in turn does not sound like the 45 Air Force band. It was always constantly evolving. There's no one Glenn Miller. There's a series of Glenn Millers. He brilliantly led difficult musicians. I call it herd the cats. You heard the story of the guys complaining, he made us shave our mustaches. Well, think about all the pressure he was under from all these mid-level music officers and other Army people, saying, well, you have all these spoiled musicians in your unit, you let them do anything they want. So he felt that he especially had to exert discipline on them because they were under the spotlight. And I don't think some of the guys realized that from time to time, how pressured he was under. He organized the best team, not necessarily the best talent. He had a lot of very interesting people available to him in the Army Air Forces that he farmed out. Joe Bushkin, famous pianist with Tommy Dorsey, ace pianist. He ends up in San Bernardino, California. Ziggy Elman, he ends up in Long Beach, not with Glenn. Think about that. But Glenn did bring in people that he thought fit. And a lot of junior guys from Vaughn Monroe, for example, Bobby Nichols, people like that who were not yet big stars. But he blended that team beautifully. That was how he did what he did. He evolved, improved his musical style and formats. He was a brilliant man. And I'll end this by showing a wonderful picture. This is Glenn. In 1942, I believe it might have been taken in 41, looking over his property in then Monrovia, now Duarte, in Southern California. And that's Tuxedo Junction that he's looking at. And as you can see, the air pollution in the San Gabriel Valley off in the distance. And what might have been? It was a life of great value and consequence to himself, his family, and most importantly, us. He gave us a lot. And we enjoy our legacy today.
Don't forget tomorrow, same time, same station, Uncle Sam presents another famous service band with music from us to you.
Historic